And the game award goes to Clair Obscur, Expedition 33.
Clair Obscur, Expedition 33. Clair Obscur, Expedition 33. Clair Obscur, Expedition 33.
Jennifer English!
Lauréat Testa.
Clair Obscur, Expedition 33.
Expedition 33.
Clair Obscur, Expedition 33.
Every year one game walks away with the biggest prize in gaming, and every year the internet immediately decides that the award is either objectively correct or proof that the industry is completely out of touch. But in 2025 something different happened. People weren't just angry about who won, they were questioning why the system still exists at all. Because when Expedition 33 started sweeping awards, it didn't feel like a surprise, it felt like a reaction to burnout, to bloated blockbusters, to AAA games that cost hundreds of millions and somehow still feel unfinished. So today let's talk about the Game Awards. Not as a popularity contest, not as a conspiracy, but as a mirror, and what the mirror accidentally revealed in 2025. Have you ever wondered why some games feel destined to win awards long before they even release, while others, sometimes just as impactful, barely enter the conversation at all? Every year millions of players watch the Game Awards hoping to see their experiences reflected on that stage. And every year a familiar pattern repeats itself. The biggest games, the biggest studio, the biggest spectacles. At first glance that feels reasonable. After all, awards are supposed to celebrate excellence, and excellence is often loud, expensive and cinematic. For a long time this logic worked. When The Witcher 3 won Game of the Year, few people questioned it. When God of War claimed the title in 2018, it felt like the natural conclusion of a carefully crafted prestige project. When Elden Ring dominated its year, most players didn't argue, they simply accepted that something monumental had happened. These wins made sense because they aligned with what the Game Awards had always valued: scale, production quality, ambition measured in square kilometers, but over time that consistency began to feel less like stability and more like stagnation. The Game Awards became predictable, not because the winners were bad, but because the definition of greatness rarely changed. Games that were massive, cinematic and technically impressive were rewarded again and again. Games that took risks, stayed focused, or rejected excess had to fight much harder for recognition. This didn't cause outrage at first, it caused acceptance, and acceptance slowly turned into emotional distance. By the time 2025 arrived, many players weren't watching the Game Awards with excitement anymore. They were watching out of habit, like tuning into a yearly tradition you already know by heart. Even controversies felt different. When The Last of Us Part 2 won in 2020, the internet exploded, but the argument was still rooted in passion. People cared deeply even when they disagreed. In 2025 the reaction was quieter, more restrained, less emotional. Instead of shouting "this is wrong", players asked something more unsettling: is this still for us? That question cut deeper than any angry tweet ever could, because the Game Awards don't just hand out trophies, they shape perception. They influence what studios chase, what publishers greenlight, what developers believe success is supposed to look like. When the same types of games are celebrated year after year, the message becomes clear: this is the safest path to recognition, and safety over time becomes exhausting. Players began to notice that many award-favored games were technically impressive but strangely hollow. Games that reviewed well, sold well, and then quietly faded from conversation a few months later. They weren't bad experiences, they were forgettable ones. Meanwhile, smaller or more focused games had to be impossible to ignore just to stand the chance. Titles like Disco Elysium, Hades or It Takes Two didn't politely earn recognition, they forced the conversation to change. By 2025, that imbalance became impossible to overlook. The Game Awards weren't under fire because they celebrated quality. They were under fire because they kept celebrating the same kind of quality long after players had started craving something else. And that growing disconnect set the stage for one of the most interesting moments in the show's history, when a game that didn't follow the usual prestige blueprint began winning anyway. Have you ever wondered how a single game ends up representing an entire year of creativity, experimentation, and player experience? Because when a trophy is handed out on stage, it feels decisive, final, authoritative. But behind that moment is a system, and like any system, it doesn't just reward quality, it rewards visibility, familiarity, and alignment with its own values. The Game Awards are not decided by a massive player vote. Despite the illusion of interactivity, the public voice plays only a small role. The majority of decisions come from a curated jury made up of media outlets and industry voices. On paper, this makes sense. Critics have experience, they play broadly, they understand context, but systems shape outcomes. Media outlets don't experience games in a vacuum. They operate under time pressure, review cycles, preview events, embargoes, and that naturally favors games that arrive with polish, marketing momentum, and early access. A massive AAA release doesn't just get reviewed, it dominates coverage. Trailers drop everywhere, preview impressions circulate weeks in advance. By the time voting happens, those games are already familiar. Smaller or riskier projects don't get that luxury. They often arrive quietly, they need time to be discovered. And time is something award cycles rarely allow. This creates an unspoken filter, not a conspiracy, a bias of structure. The system doesn't ask which game grew the most over time, it asks which game stood out when attention was at its peak. And attention is a limited resource. That's why past winners offer shared common traits. They are large in scope, polished in presentation, easy to contextualize in a trailer or a soundbite. God of War, Red Dead Redemption 2, Elden Ring, these are games that communicate their prestige instantly. You don't need a paragraph to explain them, a single cinematic shot does the work. This doesn't mean they aren't excellent, it means they are legible. The award system is optimized for legibility, but legibility isn't the same as impact. Some of the most meaningful games take time to understand, they unfold slowly, they resist easy summaries. Games like Disco Elysium didn't win because they fit the system, they won because they were impossible to ignore. They forced the machinery to adapt, and that's the exception, not the rule. Over time, this shapes expectations. Developers learn what gets rewarded, publishers learn what looks award-worthy, and players learn what the industry considers legitimate success. This is where the tension begins, because when the same kind of games are rewarded year after year, the awards stop feeling like a reflection of gaming culture and start feeling like a feedback loop, a loop where prestige reinforces itself. By 2025, the loop had become visible, not because the winners were bad, but because the process behind them felt increasingly disconnected from how players actually experience games. And once players see the machinery, it becomes harder to believe the medals are neutral. Have you ever wondered why so many players say they are excited for new AAA games and then quietly stop talking about them a few weeks after launch? Because for a long time bigger meant better. Bigger words, longer campaigns, more systems layered on top of systems, and for years that formula worked. AAA games were where innovation happened. They set standards, they defined generations, but somewhere along the way, scale stopped feeling ambitious and started feeling mandatory. Open worlds grew larger but not deeper, skill trees expanded but choice rarely mattered, playtime inflated while meaning stayed the same. Instead of asking why a mechanic existed, many games simply asked how many. How many collectibles, how many upgrades, how many hours. Players didn't burn out because games were bad, they burned out because games were exhausting. By the time 2025 arrived, fatigue wasn't a sudden collapse, it was the end of a long build-up. Players had lived through years of launches that promised everything, and delivered something that felt oddly familiar. Games that were technically impressive, visually stunning, and emotionally disposable. You could feel it in reviews. Phrases like solid but safe or another strong entry became common. praise that sounded less like excitement and more like obligation. Even the wins felt routine, and when excellence becomes routine, it stops feeling special. This fatigue wasn't just about repetition, it was about trust. Players were tired of games launching unfinished, of performance patches being treated as futures, of being told to wait 6 months for the real experience. At some point, the promise of scale stopped compensating for the lack of focus. Contrast that with moments when players felt re-energized, when Breath of the Wild threw out the checklist and trusted curiosity, when Elden Ring refused to explain itself and let players fail, when Baldur's Gate 3 embraced complexity instead of sending it down. These games weren't refreshing because they were bigger, they were refreshing because they felt intentional. By 2025, that word intentional mattered more than ever. Players didn't want endless content, they wanted cohesion. They wanted games that respected their time, their intelligence and their attention. And most AAA releases in 2025 didn't fail catastrophically. They failed quietly, they launched, they sold, they faded. That silence, not outrage, is what defines fatigue. Because when players stop complaining, they've already checked out. And that cultural mood set the stage for something unexpected. A game that didn't try to be everything, a game that didn't stretch itself thin, a game that arrived with clarity instead of promises. And in a year defined by exhaustion, that difference was impossible to ignore. Have you ever noticed how some games don't announce themselves as masterpieces, but slowly become impossible to ignore? That was Expedition 33. It didn't arrive with massive expectations or endless previews. It didn't promise to redefine the genre or change gaming forever. It simply arrived confident, focused and complete. And in 2025 that alone felt unusual. While many AAA releases were trying to be everything at once, Expedition 33 chose restraint. It knew what experience it wanted to deliver, and just as importantly, what it didn't need. There was no sense of padding, no mechanics that existed only to inflate playtime, no features that felt bolted on because players expect this now. Every system pointed in the same direction. That clarity mattered, because by this point players had become extremely sensitive to design bloat. They could feel when a game was stretching itself thin, and they could feel when a game respected their time. Expedition 33 didn't ask players to commit to an endless journey, it asked them to engage, and that distinction is subtle but powerful. The game's identity was immediately readable, not because it was loud or cinematic, but because it was cohesive. Its mechanics reinforced its themes, its pacing supported its tone, its challenge served its intention, not a retention metric. Nothing felt like it existed to satisfy an algorithm, and that made it stand out, especially in an world landscape that had grown accustomed to scale as a substitute for purpose. When Expedition 33 began winning awards, the reaction wasn't disbelief, it was recognition. Players didn't say how did this win, they said of course it did, because the win didn't feel like the industry patting itself on the back. It felt like the industry acknowledging a shift, a quiet admission that players were no longer impressed by its sheer size, that ambition without focus no longer carried the same weight. Expedition 33 succeeded not by rejecting AAA values entirely, but by rejecting excess. It didn't feel small, it felt considered, and in 2025 consideration was rare. The awards didn't just reward quality, they rewarded timing. Expedition 33 arrived at the exact moment players were ready for something different, something honest, something that felt made with intent rather than obligation. That's why its success resonated beyond trophies. It became a symbol, not of rebellion, but of recalibration. A reminder that progress doesn't always mean bigger budgets or louder marketing, sometimes it means clarity, sometimes it means knowing when to stop adding and start refining, and in a year defined by fatigue, that choice didn't just win awards, it won trust. So, are the Game Awards still valid? My answer is yes, but not in the way many people expect. They aren't a definitive ranking of quality, they aren't a final verdict on what games should be, they are a snapshot, a snapshot of what the industry values at a specific moment in time, and sometimes of what it's struggling to let go of. In 2025, the Game Awards didn't suddenly become more honest or more player focused. What changed was the cultural pressure around them. Players were tired, developers were stretched, and the gap between spectacle and meaning had become impossible to ignore. Expedition 33 didn't win because the system was perfect. It won because the moment demanded something different, and for once the awards reflected that shift. So maybe the Game Awards aren't about defining greatness, maybe their real value is accidental. They reveal trends, they expose fatigue, they show us when the industry's definition of excellence starts to wobble. In that sense they are still valid, not as judges but as mirrors. And in 2025 that mirror showed an industry ready to move on. For more deep dives into the gaming industry, subscribe to this channel. Peace and love and see you next time.